Hello, Salam. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. I can't hear you at all.
Sir, can you hear me now?
Now, yes, now I can.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sir, thank you for accepting my request. I'm very and I know you I know you were very busy today. Today you are very
It's okay,
busy.
thank you.
Thanks again. And let me tell to my if you friends, please let me. Then I start in interview after 1 minute, and I ask question after 1 minute. Can I? Can you let me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, sir. I ask question from you. Sir, please introduce you to my completely. Thank you.
Shall I start?
Sir, introduce you completely. Yourself, introduce yourself
Okay,
completely.
sure. I'll start. Okay. Well, thank you, Ramin, for this opportunity. Just to say something about myself, I am basically an intellectual historian who works on
Okay.
philosophy in Islam, particularly from 1500, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Exeter. You want me to say more, or?
Sir, you can keep your answer or finish your answer.
You want me to say something about the background, or you want me just to say who I am?
Sir, دکتر عباسیان الان توی لایو مان هستن. خب دکتر عباسیان رئیس مؤسسه صلح پژوهی هست. خب ایشون میگن که یه بیوگرافی کامل از خودتون بدید. من رزومه شما رو برای دکتر عباسیان فرستادم. میشه یه بیوگرافی کامل از خودتون بدید؟ ممنون میشم.
معرفی مفصل تر.
What?
معرفی مفصل تر یعنی. Okay.
Okay. I'm waiting.
So, As I said, I'm an intellectual historian who works on Islamic philosophy in the period, particularly from 1500. I started off by reading history as an undergraduate. So my background is as a historian. And then after my undergraduate degree, I continued with a master's and then a PhD. The master's was broadly speaking on the study of the Middle East. And during my master's, I started work on the Hikmat tradition. So I wrote a master's dissertation on Mullah Hadi Sabzawari and the Shari Manzume. And then after that, I continued with my PhD, which was originally going to be a very large project on the development of Hikmat.
Please, sir, excuse me. Please slowly speak. Can you slowly speak?
Okay.
Thank you.
So as I was saying, in terms of my doctorate, my original project was going to be something which looks at the whole range of philosophical traditions, starting from about the 14th century all the way through to the 18th century. But in the end, I focused very much on the philosophy of Mullah Sadr Shirazi. And in particular, I wrote my dissertation on his concept of Tashkik al-Wujud. So that was now about 20 years ago. I finished my PhD at Cambridge in the year 2000. And since then, I began teaching. My first positions were in religious studies. And now for the past 16 years, I have been teaching, researching at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. And some years ago, I was also the director of the Institute. And within the Institute, I am one of the people who works on the study of Islam.
Okay, sir. Okay. You must read Islamic philosophy, about Islamic philosophy, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. سر دکتر عباسیان یک سوالی ازتون کردن. چشم های دکتر عباسیان، من گوشی رو یکم ثابت نگه می‌دارم دکتر جان. دکتر عباسیان یک سوالی کردن، میخوام که این سوال رو از شما بپرسم. شما در مورد صلح و فلسفه، رابطه صلح و فلسفه نظری دارید یا نه؟ ایشون میخواستن این رو از شما بپرسن.
So specifically, I don't, but I think the way I would see philosophy is that I think philosophy is fundamentally something which is dialogical. It's something which is about questions and it's about opening conversations. So insofar as a philosophy can be a way for us to understand ourselves, understand our world, and also understand each other, it can certainly open a path for making peace. So in that level, yes, there is obviously a connection. But as I said, this is not something which I specifically work on. My work has been mainly in the area of metaphysics, the history of metaphysics, the conception of the nafs and so forth.
Okay, so I ask next question. I want to start the question about philosophy itself. Do philosophy or philosophers set criteria for those who want to become philosopher? In other words, what should one do if one wants to become a philosopher? Have they set component and criteria or not? Or as the Iranian poet Rumi, you know Maulana?
Yeah, of course.
Yes. or as the Iranian poet Rumi says حالا من فارسیش رو براتون میگم شعر رو به صورت فارسی براتون میگم میگه که هر کسی کو در شک و پیچانی است او در جهان فلسفی پنهانی است. حالا نظرتون در مورد این رو میتونید بگید؟
Right. Yes, so what is philosophy? How does one become a philosopher? And I guess how does one relate philosophy to other fields?
Just speak slowly, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So obviously this is a very big question, right? And of course there are the traditional responses within the tradition. One of the issues is what do we call this particular field of inquiry, right? Do we call it hikmat? Do we call it falsafa, etc.? And really, if we use the term hikmat and the way in which the term hikmat has been used, certainly I would say from the 12th, 13th, 14th century onwards, then this is really a way of understanding the world, understanding ourselves, understanding a relationship between different kinds of existences and existence in a discursive manner by formulating arguments and so that that understanding can be communicated, right? So that one engages in a particular kind of tahqiq, an inquiry, an investigation into these sorts of questions. But the other thing, of course, that hikmat threw up is the idea that this is not just an intellectual inquiry which is separated from who we are. So, for example, this is an intellectual inquiry which also has ethical commitments, right? Because the whole idea of philosophy is that it's a love of wisdom, it's seeking wisdom, right? And the method, the approach which I've taken, particularly to the study of philosophy in the Safavid period, is the method of the late French philosopher Pierre Hadot. And Pierre Hadot's idea was that philosophy is very much a way of life. It's a set of ethical commitments. It is living within a particular community of ethical commitments, being a student of a particular sage, so that one can arrive at the understanding of the world that that particular sage has as well, right? So it's an intellectual inquiry, it's an ethical commitment, and alongside that there are also spiritual exercises, as he puts it. So these spiritual exercises are not just ways of treating one's intellect and exercising one's intellect, but they can also involve other kinds of activities which are about disciplining the self, disciplining who one is. So that paradigm of philosophy as a way of life, I think, is a very important one for understanding what philosophy is. Of course, what has now happened is that over history we've had lots of different traditions of philosophy, but what has certainly emerged is that in more recent times philosophy has become a professionalized way of doing things, a discipline. There are philosophy departments, and in a sense that process of professionalization has led to broadly speaking, a narrowing of what philosophy is about. So most philosophers do not concern themselves with big questions, right? They do not concern themselves with the meaning of life necessarily. But often most philosophers deal with particular areas, particular kinds of questions, right? And within that, of course, we know there are lots of different traditions of philosophy. So we have analytic traditions of philosophy, we have continental traditions of philosophy, we have pragmatism, we have phenomenology, And then, of course, there are all the different kinds of traditions of philosophy which have arisen out of particular cultural contexts, whether those contexts are in India or in China or in Japan or in Africa or in the Americas and so forth. So in some ways, it's very difficult to bind all of these very different practices and conceptions of philosophy into a singular definition. And that also begs a very important question, which is whether philosophy is truly a universal thing, right? Is philosophy a universal human activity?
Yes.
And so what, in a sense, brings together these different practices of philosophy? What brings together even the distinction between philosophy which is written, the philosophical treatises that people write in different traditions, and maybe philosophy which is not written, which is articulated, which is orally taught in cultures where orality might be privileged over literacy, but also for pragmatic reasons as well. And increasingly, I think what's happening is this is precisely the question we have to ask. What is it that makes philosophy universal? And if it is universal, how do we engage philosophy at different levels for different kinds of people? Starting from children at school all the way through to universities and of course beyond, even continuing to take philosophy, into the public sphere. I mean, of course, you've got social media, but there's this question of philosophy on TV, in other kinds of media as well, so that people continually engage with it.
Okay.
Now, of course, in that question, it then it raises this question of what might be the features.
Sir, excuse
Yes.
me. Let me say this in Persian, this sentence. اجازه بدید که من این سوال رو یک بار به فارسی از شما هم بپرسم تا دوستان هم متوجه بشن. میخواستم my main question that is سوال اصلی من این هست: آیا فلسفه و فیلسوفان برای کسی که میخواد فیلسوف بشه آیا شرایط رو ایجاد کردند که با مثلا من که میخوام فیلسوف بشم باید این شرایط رو داشته باشم، یا طبق تعریف مولانا هر کسی که در شک و پیچانی است او فلسفی پنهانی است و لازم نیست فیلسوف، یا آیا لازمه که تحصیلات آکادمیک داشته باشه یا اینکه نه هر کسی که تفکر عمیق داشته باشه و تفکر انتقادی و عمیق داشته باشه فیلسوف هست؟ و آیا فلسفه و فیلسوفان برای شخصی که میخواد فیلسوف بشه آیا ویژگی هایی و شرایطی رو در نظر گرفتن یا نه؟
Okay.
Your answer. Thank you.
Okay, so that's an interesting question, because what I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, we've had this professionalization and narrowing of philosophy to mean a particular kind of discipline in university contexts, right? Which has its own literature and it has its own conceptions of history. On the other hand, of course, we have philosophy perhaps in the way in which people use it in a more general, everyday manner, right? So in an everyday manner, people talk about someone having a philosophy. And by that, all they mean is having a particular way in which they look at the world and look at themselves, right? So when you describe someone having a philosophy, it's what is their approach to life? What is their approach to their fellow human? What is the way in which they see the world? What sort of worldview do they have? Sort of this notion of a not in an ideologized sense, but this kind of notion that you have in Persian of Jahanbini, right? Jahanbini as a world,
yes.
the way in which you see the world, right? And I think that's fine, because to an extent, what I was trying to say is that there is a connection between these two different conceptions of philosophy.
Sir, excuse me. You very quickly, you slowly speak, please.
Okay,
نه
fine.
الان خیلی با سرعت دارید حرف میزنید، من زیاد متوجه نمیشم، یکم آرومتر حرف بزنید.
So what I'm suggesting is that there are two conceptions of philosophy. One is philosophy as a discipline, and the other one is philosophy as a common sense understanding of a person's worldview, right? And the sorts of questions that they might ask about themselves and about their world. Now, what I'm saying is that there is a connection between the two. And that is the way in which, for example, in a number of European countries,
Yes.
children are introduced to philosophy at an early age. And the reason why that is done is because there is a recognition that all of us, from a very early age, ask questions about ourselves and our world. And what basically happens is, as people get older, those questions become formalized. And from that formalization, we get sets of the different branches of philosophy as we understand it, right? So, people from a very early age ask, who am I? Why am I here? Why am I on this planet? Why am I not on another planet? What would, maybe if I was not, what would be? If I was not here, what would things be like? Sometimes they ask questions if they've been brought up in a religious context about, okay, so what is God? Where is God? Right? How does he relate to this world, to relate to us? So these are philosophical, these are also theological questions, but they are at the heart philosophical questions. And, one of the reasons why you want to bring some sort of a philosophical framework for those sorts of questions at a school level is so that it helps people as they grow up to understand how best to formulate questions about these things, right? And as I said, of course, later what often happens is that questions about who am I, where do I fit within this particular world, what is my very nature, what are the different causes or things which have an impact on me, what sort of things do I impact upon. These become questions of metaphysics, right, as they're formalized. And then the sort of classic questions which we often ask, how do I know something, right? So how do I know whether there is a table in front of me? How do I know more abstract things? How do I know what the notion of good is or bad is? These then become kind of these sort of issues around epistemology, which we then consider as a branch of philosophy. And then, of course, the whole question of what is the relationship between perhaps who we are and how we ought to be, right? How we ought to be, how we ought to think, how we ought to act, how we ought to behave with one another. These then become formalized into questions of ethics, right? Now, so you can ask very simple questions about yourself, about your world, about your fellow humans, and the nature of those questions can then easily be related then to a particular branch of philosophy as it has emerged in a more formalized sense. And then, of course, there's this wider question which can be asked about whether there is a particular kind of methodology in philosophy, right? Every type of humanity, every attempt at understanding what it means to be human, arguably is also, has its own kind of methodology. So literature potentially has its own methodology, philosophy has its own methodology, law has its own methodology, and so forth. And then, of course, within the context of philosophy, one could say that the methodology of philosophy is, I guess, what you might call argumentation, right? And argumentation then begs the question of, does argumentation have certain kinds of rules? And then that takes us towards things like logic and formal aspects of argumentation. It also takes us sometimes to things like rhetoric and persuasive forms of argumentation. And it can also take us towards the artistic and the aesthetic, because it takes us to things like poetry. Because poetry arguably is also making a form of an argumentation.
Yes.
So I would say argumentation is very much key to the method of philosophy, but it has to be understood in this broad sense. What of course happened in the Islamic tradition is that argumentation was very narrowly associated with Aristotle's logic, right? But actually the way in which humans argue and communicate with one another is much broader than just, you know, qiyas and burhan and these sorts of things. There are many other kinds of issues which are related to this. Someone actually asked whether philosophy was just about asking questions. And I think that's a very important question. So broadly speaking, yes, I think philosophy is about helping people to ask the right sort of, or the most appropriate sorts of questions, right? Ones which are productive to help you understand yourself and your world. I don't think philosophy is necessarily about finding those answers, but I think it's about asking better kinds of questions, more refined and more appropriate questions. Because if it was just about answers and correct answers and systems, then of course we have many different systems out there. How do we adjudicate? How do we judge between these different systems of thought and of questioning? And that's why I think I would place the emphasis much more on the questions and asking good and appropriate questions than necessarily the answers and the production of systems.
Okay, sir, let me ask a little question from you. Excuse me. Sir, you can say briefly, did philosophy and philosophy create the conditions for becoming a philosopher? Can you answer yes or no? به صورت بله یا خیر جواب میتونید بدید به صورت یه جنبندی آیا میتونید اینو جواب بدید؟
I think it's a bit complicated. And the reason why I say that is because, you know, if we look at it in terms of a particular kind of training, and at the end of that training one can become a philosopher who is on a path to wisdom, then yes, there are many such models of training. Is there a particular way which kind of produces a philosopher in the way in which, say, Plato would understand a true philosopher, or Aristotle would understand a true philosopher, or Kant would understand a true philosopher, or Mullah Sadra? I think that's a bit more complicated. Of course, they would suggest that if you follow their method, that you can do it. But if these were perfect methods which were which could be replicated in different contexts, then maybe lots of people would. And of course, that begs the other question about what is the use of it, right? I mean, if one becomes a philosopher, how is that going to help you? If one becomes a philosopher, how is that going to help you? Will that help you solve your problems in life? Will that help bring about universal peace? and an end to suffering, and some sort of contentment, some notion of salvation or nirvana, or and so forth. Now, of course, all of these philosophical traditions argue that if you follow their method, that you will achieve this, right? That there will be a discernible good effect upon you if you follow this particular path, right? But of course, many things about humans are not necessarily universal. So one has to then also think about one's particular context and one's particular cultural context. A lot of traditions talk about the way in which you liberate yourself and understand your world and achieve some sort of contentment is through some sort of training of your mind and your soul.
Okay. Thanks for your answer.
There perhaps isn't an agreement on how you do this.
Okay, thanks for your answering. Sir, I ask the next question. Have you read the Stace book? In the Stace book on the mysticism and philosophy.
I didn't hear this question. Can you say it again?
Have you read Stace book on mysticism and philosophy?
Oh, experience, yes. Yes. William Stace.
Yes. اجازه بدید من این رو به فارسی بپرسم دوستان هم متوجه بشن. شما کتاب عرفان و فلسفه استیس رو مطالعه کردید. در اون کتاب استیس سعی میکنه بین تجربه های عرفانی اصیل و تجربه های عرفانی کاذب و غیر اصیل و شبه عرفانی دیمرکیت ایجاد کنه. این فارسیش یادم رفت. دیمرکیت ایجاد کنه. آیا تجربه های چیزی شبیه تجربه های کاذب و شبه تجربه در فلسفه وجود داره؟ یعنی نظریات کاذب و به اصطلاح فلسفه بافی در فلسفه وجود داره یا نه؟ و ما نیازمند مرزبندی در فلسفه هستیم یا نه؟ اگر پاسختان مثبت باشه چطور این کار رو باید انجام بدیم؟
Yeah, so I mean this question of what is a real mystical experience, right? And whether real mystical experiences actually happen, right? Now, of course, there are different ways of approaching it, and you know what is often, certainly in terms of the debate more recently. I mean, Stace was writing a while ago, but you get the development in the philosophy of mysticism, certainly since in the last 30 years or so, of the idea that either mystical experience does not exist, quite simply because following Kant, we are very suspicious of any claims towards direct experience, right? So this is what's known as the constructivist school. And so they would argue, well, what tends to happen is we read lots of accounts of mysticism, right? So we read accounts of Plotinus, of Maulana, of Ibn Arabi, etc. And so then we get used to a particular way in which we should talk about or qualify what mystical experience is. And so then all we do is we just repeat this. It becomes a established set of social linguistic conventions that we then use to describe something that we claim we are having a mystical experience. On the other hand, of course, you have plenty of other people who think that no, pure consciousness, which is the term that is often used, is entirely possible. But pure consciousness does not necessarily have to be the ecstasy of someone like Plotinus, right? So you have the very famous account that you have in Plotinus of which comes through the Uthologia, ربما خلوت بنفسي وخلعت بدني, and all this stuff, and ascending to this higher realm of light and ecstasy. And
Ecstasy.
yes, bahjat, if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, the thing with that is, so what some philosophers of mysticism or pure consciousness, such as Robert Foreman, suggest is actually pure consciousness can be more straightforwardly a way in which, through types of contemplation and meditation, one can empty oneself so that one is no longer aware of a distinction between the consciousness as such and yourself, right? So it's a certain type of fana, but it's a very straightforward thing. It's kind of a lack of self-awareness. It doesn't necessarily have to be these wonderful lights and ecstasy and so forth. Now, and of course, then you have yet another kind of school which says, well, yes, pure consciousness is very true, and one of the ways we know it's true is that we look at all of these different accounts in different cultural contexts, and the quality of those accounts is very similar, right? So, for example, we talk about the feeling of oneness, we talk about fana, we talk about bahjat and surur, and all these things, and you find Buddhists talking about these things, you find Taoists talking about these things, you find Christian mystics talking about these things. So from that perspective, it becomes a universal thing, and this of course is what's known as the perennialist school. So perennialism is the idea that ultimately all of these different mystical traditions reflect the same tradition. It's ultimately there's only one tradition. It's just manifest in different cultures in different ways, right? So I think there might be something for saying that yes, there is such a thing as mystical experience and pure consciousness, but it perhaps is not as simply a singular thing which is everywhere, nor is it necessarily the most exciting, ecstatic thing, everything. It could be something which is much more straightforward. Learned as well. There could be a sense in which it is learnt as well.
Sir, your sound is connected and disconnected.
I finished. Can you hear me?
Yes, now I hear you. Now, yes, I hear you. Okay, thank you from your answering. Thanks. My back started to hurt. Okay, I ask next question, sir. I say English and to Farsi. Has philosophy be able to bear useful fruit in society in practice, or has it been merely a mere theory and rhetoric? آیا فلسفه در جامعه تونسته یه ثمره عملی داشته باشه و تونسته یک مسئله ای رو حل بکنه یا نه؟
I think that's a very good question. That's a very good question. It's a bit like saying, it's a bit like asking, are philosophers good people, right? Or are philosophers useful people in society? And of course, there is a very old problem which goes back to Plato, right? So, famously you have this argument or this objection in Plato, which is known as akrasia, right? So akrasia is this idea that you can know what is good, you can know what is bad, and yet you still do not act according to it, right? And then that, of course, begs the question of how sound is your knowledge that it doesn't actually have an impact upon you. Because, of course, in a lot of the conceptions of ethics, or particularly of virtue ethics that exist from the Greek tradition onwards, certainly in the Islamic tradition, the idea is that if you know what is good and if you know what is bad, then the sort of the perfection of that knowledge is that you act accordingly, right? Now, as I said, I suspect for a lot of people, certainly for professional philosophers, that yes, they of course they love what they do, but at the same time it's also a job. They think that their main contribution to society, and I think this is not just true of philosophy, but it's true of other humanities, they would say that the main contribution they have to society is that they help people perfect the way in which they argue. They help people in their development of their critical thinking and their critical analysis of the world and themselves, right? So that's the main kind of utility, is critical thinking and argumentation, right?
Sir, right. I think that philosophy does not. Philosophy don't solve anything in the society.
Yeah. So you're a skeptic, and I kind of accept that.
Sorry, the Professor Clark join us. Hello, Professor Clark.
Hi, Kelly.
شما ادامه بدید. ممنون.
Yes. So what I was, yes, I understand that, and I think this question of the utility of philosophy may have something to do with this question of the language, right? So sometimes the problem is that maybe philosophers are engaging in a language which is not terribly communicable, and they fail to explain or to convey to people why certain modes of thinking, why certain kinds of questions, why thinking through the sorts of questions that we ask are useful to our everyday life, right? So one of them could be something as simple as, let's take the concept of truth, right? Now we have lots of philosophical theories of truth. You know, what do we mean when we talk about truth? Is there such a thing as truth? Is it singular? Is it multiple, etc.? But perhaps even before that, what people should really be asking themselves is, to what extent is it useful for us to have a widely understood conception of truthfulness, right? How useful is the concept of something being truthful to us? Are there things which are commonly agreed on as facts? Can we agree on something being not truthful or false, right? And of course, there's great utility in life to having the notion of truthfulness being widely accepted. You know, if you are walking around in society and you stop someone and ask someone a simple question, then of course you want to believe that that person will give you a straightforward and truthful answer, which will be useful to you. Because if people do not systematically do that, then it becomes very difficult to orient yourself within society. If every time you ask someone something and the expectation is that they would not be truthful insofar as it would help you understand your situation and what you needed, then you would have pretty much chaos in society, right? Now, of course, above and beyond that, we can have, as I said, arguments about, is there an ultimate truth? Are there absolute grounds and foundations for the question of truth, but more simply the very notion of something being truthful and the notion of something being false, and how it is that we might go around testing those questions are clearly very important and useful for us in society.
Okay. Thanks for answering, dear professor. Sir, my friend asked a question, sent me a question about Islamic philosophy. Can I ask from you?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I find this question. Does Islamic philosophy have the potential to answer the world's current issues such as the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of the environment, and issues related to sexual freedom and war and its.
That's again a very good question. I think the obvious way to deal with that question is, first of all, ask what we mean by Islamic philosophy, right? So if by Islamic philosophy we mean these particular historical traditions coming from Ibn Sina, Mullah Sadwa, etc., Sohrawardi, then what we do know is that most of these sorts of questions, which you've talked about, are not directly raised in those philosophical traditions. What starts to happen, of course, in the 20th century especially, is the development of what you might call a social or an ethical turn. And you find that social ethical turn, sometimes even an element of a linguistic turn as well, which emerges, for example, in Iran through Kalam-e-Jadid, right? So through people like Allama Tabatabai and Murta Mutahari,
Yes.
and of course through people like Taha Abdul Rahman in Morocco. And with these thinkers, basically what you have is a sense of saying, okay, so we have this particular philosophical tradition, but let's see how the principles, the metaphysical principles, the epistemological issues can be then related to our social and ethical sphere. And so they make an effort to do that. Now, whether those efforts have been conclusive and have been effective and efficacious is a different matter. So, as you know, Allama Tabatabai had this conception of i'tibariyat, right? So the idea of conventional notions which arise in pretty much everything which is in the social sphere, in the ethical sphere. And so in that sense, what really is being put forward is the idea that we need to constantly be asking ourselves what are the most appropriate sorts of questions that we should ask about these issues, right? Does it mean that we necessarily come up with a singular set of solutions? I don't think that's necessarily the case. Because any solution, any kind of question and answer we come up with is in itself also i'tibari, just as the whole kind of field of inquiry is. And so I think there is an important way in which we are constantly in this process of rethinking, re-evaluating what is the most appropriate question to be asked, right? So, in the medieval period, when people talked about war, for example, when they talked about whether the use of violence was something which was justified, right? Or what could give a particular type of imposition upon another legitimacy, right? In what circumstances could you take the life of another person? But maybe nowadays we look at the question of violence and of conflict in a much broader sense. And that is partly because, for example, we understand there are different ways in which we try to control ourselves and we try to control others, that we try to make sense of things, which, for example, following someone like Foucault is now traditionally called governmentality. And within that context, we then start to see things like violence and conflict in a much more global sense, right? So violence and conflict exists in lots of different ways. It can happen purely in the way in which I speak to you, right? It can happen in forms of institutions and structures that exist. Without me necessarily even touching you, I can still be violent towards you. There are systems of discrimination, of bigotry, which can work as extreme forms of conflict and war and imposition, which are as important and, in fact, impact on more people's lives than necessarily the actual examples we have of armed conflicts in different contexts around the world. And so you can say that for pretty much every kind of approach of how it is that we come up with better kinds of questions. Of course, there is a different question then which could be raised of what is the role of theology in that? So perhaps not the question of philosophy, but what is the role of theology? So is there something within rational understandings of Islam? Is there something within scriptural understandings of Islam which can help us to ask the sorts of questions? But I think those are slightly different. They're theological questions, and sometimes, again, they can also perhaps be ones which do not end up with clear-cut solutions and answers, but opening up the right sorts of questions. And the process of asking the questions in itself can be of comfort and can be therapeutic to people. So I certainly like the idea of philosophy as therapy in that sense.
Okay, thank you for your answering, sir. Thank you, very thanks. Dear professor, I ask another question from you. Sir, who is your favorite philosopher in Western philosophy and Islamic philosophy?
That's an interesting and difficult question. So in terms of Western philosophy, I think it should be quite clear that it's probably Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher who put forward the idea of philosophy as a way of life. In terms of Islamic philosophy, just because I'm most familiar with his thought, I would have to say at the moment it is Mullah Sadra, but I find, of course, it's very difficult to find a philosopher who is truly universal in all the sorts of questions and in all the elements which can help us understand everything about our particular world, right? So not just about the 17th century or even about France in the 50s and 1960s. So I would say provisionally those two. In practice, we'd have to see. But I should also, take you back to something I said right at the beginning, which is I'm very much an intellectual historian. I'm not a philosopher. So my tastes might not be the ones which philosophers would have.
Okay, thank you. You must interest to Mullah Sadra. Okay, yes?
Yes.
I ask another question. Dear professor, there is a question about the philosophy. There is a question about the philosophy, and that is whether the world is really complex, that philosophy has not yet been able to answer the issues and problems of the world, of the philosophy uh, itself has complicated the issues and problems of the world. And problem of the world یعنی سوالم این بود که آیا دنیا اینقدر پیچیده است که فلسفه نتوانسته آن را مسائل دنیا رو حل کنه، جهان رو حل کنه، یا اینقدر پیچیده نیست و فلسفه و فلاسفه اینقدر به ما پیچیده نشان دادن. کدومش هست؟
Yeah, so that is again a very good question. I think a lot of people who don't like philosophy would say that philosophy complicates things which are simple, right? Simple, yeah. And so that's basically, I think that's partly an argument about language and communication. To say that, yes, we have very clear and straightforward questions, and philosophy unnecessarily complicates them by building up a terminology, a jargon, which only some people understand, to talk about very straightforward things. At the same time, of course, we know that there are lots of things which are very complicated, right? And some of these complicated things are also very immediate to us. Sometimes they're immediate to us without necessarily being aware of them all the time, and other times they're immediate to us and we always think about them. So simple things like existence. What does it mean for me to be? What does it mean for me to be as opposed to not to be? What is the nature of time? Is time something which is real? How does time relate to me? What is the nature of my consciousness and myself? These are all very difficult questions, which I don't think philosophy has necessarily made more complicated, but I don't think we've necessarily come to solve some of these issues. And so then what's happened now is that increasingly, I think for some of these big questions, people are saying that we need to go back to perhaps a more Aristotelian conception of philosophy or science, right? Which is holistic. So, for example, if we want to really understand what consciousness is, then we need to be bringing insights from philosophy together with theology, together with literature, together with physics, together with biology, and so forth. And so each of these different fields of inquiry has something which may help us piece together what this problem of consciousness is. Or we can go to the old solution of Sohrawardi, who basically would say consciousness is not a problem because we can't actually be aware of or know anything unless we have consciousness. It's just who we are. It's just, he has this famous phrase, irja' ila nafsik, just return to yourself. You know who you are. Your self-awareness and self-consciousness are immediate, they are infallible, and they're indubitable. And everything that we know arises from them. So if we can ascertain that we know anything and that we are aware of anything, then that already has to presuppose that we have consciousness. Right? So, as I said, I think that is one solution that has been historically, I think, a very successful solution. But I think there's also much to be said for a much more holistic approach to philosophy, science. Call it what you want. I mean, I don't think in some ways it made much difference whether you're talking about philosophy or science in the pre-modern period, because there was an idea that knowledge or the pursuit of knowledge was a holistic thing, which had different branches, of course, but they were definitely very much connected.
Thank you sir, I ask a little question. In the word or philosophy, which is complicated?
I didn't catch this. Can you repeat?
Philosophy or philosophy and word, which is complicated?
Oh, they're both complicated. They're both complicated.
No, philosophy or word.
Both.
یکیش رو فلسفه یا دنیا، یکیش رو میتونید بگید؟
هر دو.
هر دو؟
آره.
آره خوبه. ممنون از پاسختون. باشه الان سوال بعدی رو میپرسم، در مورد فلسفه اسلامی هست. آیا غزالی رو به عنوان دشمن فلسفه میدونید؟
Okay, so this is I think it's an important question. Certainly in the study of the history of philosophy, the history of philosophy in Islam, it certainly used to be held, at least up to about 50, 60 years ago, that
Yes.
Ghazali kind of killed philosophy. So that the Hafid basically is an attack upon philosophy as such. And if by that we understand by philosophy a way of understanding world, understanding the relationship between different kinds of causes, between different existences and so forth. But I don't think that's actually the aim of Ghazali in the Tahafut. And actually, if you look at his other works, if you look at the Ihya Ulumuddin, if you look at the Al-Iqtisad, even if you look at Kitab al-Madnoon, Bihi ala Ghayri Ahli, and other works like that, it's quite clear, the Mishkat al-Anwar as well, it's quite clear that he's heavily influenced by philosophy. He's even influenced by the specific doctrinal positions associated with Ibn Sina that he attacks in the Tahafut. And the arguments, for example, that Ghazali makes about acceptance of logic, about the importance of argumentation and rules for argumentation, which he then also uses in his Usul al-Fiqh, these all show that he has very much a positive, I would say, attitude towards philosophy. And it's in fact that attitude to philosophy which led later to the widespread acceptance of philosophy even within Kalam. So, for example, by the time you get to someone like Sharif Ali al-Jujani, or by the time you get to Jalaluddin Davani, it's very clear that the relationship between philosophy and Kalam is very deep and very intertwined. So what Ghazali is actually doing in the Tahafut is he is attacking particular doctrines and particular types of argument. So he's not attacking the notion of argument, he's attacking particular types of argument, and especially he's attacking this idea of speculative metaphysics. So his notion is that things like the theory of emanation, of how the cosmos issues from God, this notion of phase and sudur, these are things which are purely speculative. They do not have strong arguments, and also they contradict scripture. So this question of speculative metaphysics which contradicts scripture is important because his argument is that, I think very much, that metaphysics is there in scripture. But the metaphysics which is there in scripture, in the Quran, is not speculative. It is certain. It's certain, of course, because it comes from a sacred source. And it's certain because that sanctity can then also be verified on the horizon of one's religious and mystical experience. So his critique is not of metaphysics; it's of speculative metaphysics, which is not grounded. His critique is not of philosophy as such, but it's on or argumentation as such, but it's on particular kinds of argumentation and particular kinds of philosophical doctrine.
Okay, I want to ask a question.
And also, I mean, I think I should just quickly add that the later tradition did not consider Ghazali. Yes. Okay. The later tradition did not consider Ghazali to be an enemy of philosophy. So, for example, we have Mullah Sadwa quotes Ghazali a number of times. Now, he would not quote Ghazali if he thought Ghazali was against philosophy, against hikmat.
You mean that Ghazali enemy the philosophy, not the philosopher, not philosophy? Yes.
Sorry, Ghazali was what?
I ask in other words, do you consider Ghazali the enemy of philosophy or philosopher?
Oh, yeah. So this is something we were talking about the other day. That
your
tahafut.
Yes,
So the
your
tahafut
that
is not.
Ghazali, your mean that Ghazali enemy of the philosopher, not philosophy.
Yeah, which is precisely why the text is called Tahafut al-Falasifa, not Tahafut al-Falsafa. So there's a distinction between the two. He's talking about the incoherence or the confusion of certain philosophers. He's not talking about philosophy as such.
It's very interesting to me about Ghazali. What you said about Ghazali, it's very interesting to me. Sir, have you come to Iran?
Many times.
In what year?
Last time was 2 years ago.
What?
2 years ago, or was it 3 years ago? I think
2
2
years ago.
or 3 years ago, yes.
No, 2 years ago. پس یه چیزی میخواستم بهتون بگم، اونم این که مؤسسه صلح، فرهنگ و عقلانیت سومین همایش رو برگزار خواهد کرد. حالا میدونم که شرایط کرونایی هست. من از شما حالا درخواست میکنم که به این همایش بیاید و شرکت کنید و افتخار بدید که در این همایش شرکت کنید. آیا میتونم همچنین قولی از شما بگیرم الان؟
انشالله.
Inshallah. Thank you. Inshallah means okay or not.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Any excuse to go to Iran.
آخه انشالله معنی انشالله بعضی وقتا من نمیدونم معنیش بله هست یا خیر هست، به خاطر همین همیشه میپرسم. بله. ممنونم ازتون. I ask next question. The next question about that the philosophy, the peace and philosophy. What is your opinion about peace, love, education? That is, do we have two theories and do nothing practical to achieve peace?
You mean philosophy does not do anything practical?
Practical to achieve peace.
I think that's partly maybe because most philosophers are not engaged in that. A lot of people are not necessarily engaged in that. It's quite clear to me that if you are going to, everyone talks about the desire for peace, but as I was trying to suggest earlier, if we understand war and violence in a much more kind of holistic sense of how we behave and how we interact with each other, then we'd understand that in some ways peace starts with very simple things about our interpersonal ethics as well.
Yes.
So that clearly is of significance, and ethic and education, of course, does play a part in that. The promotion of kind of humanistic values of philosophy and literature in particular, I think, play a very important role in it. The idea of in America there's this notion of liberal education, and this idea of liberal education, liberal arts, is becoming popular in many English-speaking universities around the world, even in parts of Asia. But one thing we need to kind of recover is the idea that this, we don't necessarily have to call it liberal education, but the idea that literature and study and ta'lim and tarbiyat, etc., are all about making us human, is something that is very much within the Islamic traditions, right? So, there's a reason why people used to start their education with reading Sa'di, right? After the 13th century, people used to read Sa'di in Iran, in Central Asia, in South Asia, in lots of places, because they understood these works to be very much about what it meant to be human. They read philosophy because they understood that philosophy had something to say on this question. They read akhlaq literature precisely for that as well. So at that level, of course, education has a role to play because it's about understanding us as a human individual, and also perhaps taking us away from certain kinds of materialistic conceptions of progress, right? So a lot of our contemporary world is geared towards considering success, considering progress purely in terms of material achievement, in terms of being better at something. And something that sometimes that can be being better at even technical things. But we don't necessarily think in terms of success or progress in terms of, have we fulfilled our humanity? Have we fulfilled our humanity? And if we have fulfilled our humanity, what does that mean? And clearly one of the elements of fulfilling one's humanity is the idea of peaceful relations with others, living at peace, being at peace with oneself, and of course with having loving relations. This is also very much part of the theological traditions. I often say that one of my favorite hadith is the famous hadith which says that Iman is only hub. Iman is hub, it's love.
Sir, which hadith can you say?
Iman, Iman as in faith is hub. Yeah, it's a famous hadith. It's one version is hal al iman illa al hub, right? There's lots of variations of this. There's some of these sayings attributed to Amir al-Mu'mineen, some of them attributed to Imam Sadiq. So this is a very, very famous saying. It's quite clear that the notion of peace and love is absolutely central to the very conception of the human as a faithful person, as someone who trusts in God and trusts in one's fellow human.
Okay, this is a good answer. Thank you. Sir, just one thing, sir, dear professor, to achieve the peace, does education play a main role or just theorizing?
Of course it does.
Theorizing or education or practical philosophy or theoretical philosophy?
Of course, both. And actually, this is something that we sometimes forget, that education, whether it's going to school or going to university, it's not just what you learn from the books and say from the lectures and exams and so forth, but it's also what you learn from the social interaction and the social engagement. One of the biggest points I would say about school is that it teaches you ways to behave and be with other people, right? And it teaches you what the sorts of frameworks for that sort of interaction and relationships are. So it's not just that you learn, love, compassion, empathy, peace, by being theoretically taught the views of, say, great philosophers or religious sages or religious teachers about these things, but it was also what you learn from your interaction and experience with others, what you experience, not even just in those educational settings, but also in other types of social settings, within your family setting, within your wider interactions. So there's lots of different kinds of learning and teaching opportunities which arise with respect to this, which are very practical and also theoretical. So it's both, of course.
Okay, thank you, sir. به نظر شما آیا الان از هر دوی اینها استفاده میکنند؟ I mean the theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy. آیا از این جفتش الان استفاده میکنند یا فقط از فلسفه نظری استفاده میکنند؟
From both. So obviously there are various things which are sort of
میتونم یه چیز بگم پروفسور از ببخشید در مورد مسئله شرایط problem of evil, don't reduce the evil in the world. شر در دنیا کم نشده. بعد فلسفه به ظاهراً چیزی رو حل نکرده در این مورد، در مورد مسئله شر، فقط نظریه داده. آیا در مورد مسئله شر ما نباید از طریق عمل وارد بشیم؟ فلسفه عملی، اخلاق و آموزش و پرورش فقط، و اینجا اصلا نظریه پردازی به نظر من کافی نیست، یعنی کفایت نمیکنه. مثلا من که داغدار هستم، برای مثال من دچار شری شدم، اگر مثلا پلانتینگا بیاد نظریه دفاعی اختیارش رو بگه یا متحری بیاد عدل الهی رو بگه، جان هیک بیاد نظریه هاشون رو بگه، هیچ دردی از من دوا نمیکنه، درد من کاهش پیدا نمیکنه. به خاطر همین این نظریات به نظر من ناکارآمد هستند. نظر شما حالا چیه؟ آیا ناکارآمد هستند یا نه؟ و راهکار شما چیه؟
So
you can keep
all of these, yes. So all of these solutions to the question of evil, all the way from Proclus onwards in the ancient period, are particular solutions which make sense within a metaphysical system, right? And they have their own coherence. Whether they are satisfactory is a different matter, right? Whether they actually resolve matters is a different matter. And of course, this question about whether do we have more evil and suffering in the world now than we had before? Is it the same? Is it less? This, of course, is a matter for debate, right? So, and it's actually not that straightforward to answer that question. Of course, going back to someone like Proclus, and then Mullah Sadra has the same position, he would say that, well, there is a preponderance argument. It's a tarjih, right? So he would say that if you look at the totality of space and time, then we know that there is more good and evil over space and time. But this is something which is very difficult to prove in actual ways. Of course, one thing you could say is that in our everyday experiences, yes, there is suffering, and yes, we come across things which are bad, and yes, we come across natural evils, and yes, we come across moral evils. But can we say that the majority of even our individual experiences are ones in which the bad and the suffering outweighs the good? Right? It's kind of like a psychological sort of experiment in that sense, thought experiment in that sense. And then, of course, there's this wider issue about whether these particular theodicies, whether it's about free will, whether it's about divine mercy, whether it's about the unreality of evil, are they designed as actual metaphysical solutions, or are they part of this notion of philosophy as therapy? Are they supposed to provide comfort, or are they supposed to provide solutions, so that they help you think through these sorts of issues? And I suggest that a lot of the theodicies are supposed to be therapeutic and about providing comfort, but not necessarily providing strict answers. You know, if you go back and look at the classic article of Mackie, you know, from the 1950s, every single position he says is inadequate in that article, these are very famous positions. We know that, right? He says every single one of these is not a solution. But it begs the question of why are those particular solutions that he says is inadequate, why are they still considered to be successful, and why do people still use them? And my suggestion is because they do, in a sense, work as therapy. They do, in a sense, work as a sort of comfort, right? In the same way that poetry and rhetoric and homiletic sometimes works as therapy, as a consolation, as a form of comfort.
Consolation?
Yes.
Oh, okay. This is your suggest. It's good. Dear Professor, did the Islamic philosophy as a potential for solve the evil problem, or Western philosophy? Which one can solve this problem?
I think it depends on what the problem is. And also, I think it's not so straightforwardly a question of, I think we need to stop thinking in terms of Islamic philosophy and Western philosophy. We have lots of different traditions, cultural traditions, yes. Traditions which relate to our perhaps ethical commitments. I think the question should be the broader one, which is one of... It's possible the connection is not very good.
میشه
I think it's maybe the connection.
is, can you keep I see I can see now.
Okay. So I think this question is more, does philosophy have the ability to do so? And also within, I think we need to disaggregate so-called Western philosophy. There's lots of different traditions in Western philosophy, right? There's different schools even within analytic philosophy. There's continental philosophies. There are phenomenologies. There are types of pragmatism. There are many other kinds of philosophies. So I don't think we can say, categorically, Western philosophy can do this or that. In the same way that I think with Islamic philosophy, depends on what you mean, because there's lots of different traditions in Islamic philosophy as well. So some may be more geared towards dealing with the social and ethical, and some may not be geared towards that. So it really depends on what you mean by that. Does philosophy have the potential to deal with those questions, either through analysis, argumentation, or through therapy and consolation and comfort? Then I think, yes, in theory, it can definitely do that. But part of that requires us to have, I think, a more holistic conception of what philosophy is. Huh?
Holistic.
Holistic, yeah, holistic, like a more complete sense of what philosophy is.
Okay. I write you what said. من نوت برداری میکنم از نوشته هاتون. I ask the next question from you. According to Aristotle, who divided philosophy into three parts? Do you value theoretical philosophy the most, or practical philosophy? Which one can be considered useful in solving the problems of world? Especially, I asked before about the problem of evil. This question about the problem of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I just obviously I'd be repeating myself because I've said this, but I think it entirely depends on what you're aiming at. In the Aristotelian and in the Islamic traditions, the theoretical philosophy was considered to be superior, because the idea was that even the social and the moral sphere has to have metaphysical foundations, right? That's a very simple thing, but obviously both of them work together, and it's entirely a question of what are the situations which one is faced with, and then what sort of questions are best for dealing with those. So I don't think it's a question of one or the other. I think it's a question of considering what is most appropriate for a particular situation.
Okay, thank you from you. Sir, I ask next question. Dear Professor, when do you think peace happen in societies, and what is the need? What is the need for peace? Can this be achieved with the right training and education, or not?
Again, I think we've already discussed this, so I'm not sure I need to repeat it. I would just say that as long as there are situations of structural violence, as long as there is discrimination, as long as there is bigotry, as long as there are structural and material inequalities in societies, then of course you do not have peace. And so if you want to achieve peace, those are the sorts of issues that we have to tackle. It's those elements of discrimination, of inequalities, of subjugation, of dominance that have to be addressed if we want to have peace. And as I said again, this is through a holistic approach to education. So education is what is conveyed in the classroom, but also through the socialization of education and the way in which we teach and we nurture people through various kinds of social interactions in life. And fundamentally understanding that you can't have any sort of sense of peace unless you are truly cognizant of what you owe the other person. This is a very kind of straightforward notion that all humans have intersubjective duties and ties and bonds. Everything is about what we owe one another, and also the context in which we live. So not just what we owe one another as humans, but what we owe to the wider context of the world in which we live as well.
Okay. Thanks for your answer. It's a very good answer. Sir, dear professor, let's go back to your interests. You say your favorite philosopher, and I ask another question. Has it been resolved? What do you think are the most important issues in philosophy? Has it been resolved yet or not? Which issues are you most interested in and solve it?
I think there are lots of questions for which philosophers over
especially in philosophy of Islamic philosophy, especially.
Yeah, so obviously I think there are lots of issues which have been raised which have been considered to be successful, and then there are certain types of arguments which are successful in Islamic philosophy, and I think there are some they definitely are insightful and they still are useful for us. So two from Ibn Sina would be the idea of the wajib al-wujud, the description of God as wajib al-wujud, which is a very successful argument and a very influential argument. Another one would be his thought experiment about al-insan al-mu'allaq, this idea of where is our true self. What's in English is called the flying man argument. Then you have other kinds of positions. So you have, for example, Mullah Sadr's holistic approach to knowledge, in which he doesn't make a very strict distinction between the external senses and the internal senses. So you get the idea that ultimately every faculty of perception and understanding of the human is related to the soul. You of course have Mullah Sadr's own proof for the existence of God, which I think is a very successful one as well. And
sir, Mullah Sadra, you interest Harakat al-Johari?
Yes, I mean Harakat al-Johari also is a very important argument because it has implications for how we can understand this constant process of our becoming as humans. I think that's very significant. There are lots of other arguments. I mean, there's one very particular argument you have in Sohrawardi and afterwards on the nature of wujud, and how wujud is not something which has extramental reality. And this insight, I think, is very, very similar to some of the arguments in modern philosophy about the existential quantifier. And it's not usually presented in that particular way, but I think it's a very useful way of saying it. And you find it, for example, in Mir Damad. So, Damad famously says that, only God is wujud. And if we say, X is mawjud, then all we are saying is there is an X. So we're basically using it as a quantifier in the way in which it's used in logic and sort of contemporary philosophy language. I think that's a very interesting insight, which people usually looking at Islamic philosophy don't look at it in that way. So yes, there are lots of arguments which are successful. Are there questions which are unresolved? Of course there are, because even these questions I don't think are resolved. There are solutions which are put forward, but whether there are final answers to the question, I don't think that's the way philosophy works.
صداتون قطع شد. I can't hear you.
I'm not speaking at the moment. Yeah, there was a bit of a pause. Sorry. Yes. Can you hear me?
جوابتون رو تموم کردید؟
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, okay. سوال بعدی رو ازتون بپرسم. ممنونم از جوابتون. پروفسور عزیز و گرامی، سوال 12 رو بپرسم ازتون. How successful philosophy been solving the world problems? Has it been successful at
Yeah, I mean, I think
issues?
we've been discussing the same thing quite a bit. So, as I said, it entirely depends on how you look at it. A lot of people would say that philosophy hasn't dealt with these questions very well, but insofar as it helps people come up with better arguments, more critical ways of thinking, of being much more aware of who they are in their world, then I think in some ways philosophy is useful, regardless of whether it gives you the sorts of solutions, for example, that we expect from technology, right? So, it's not philosophy is not going to give us a vaccine for COVID, right? But philosophy can help us understand that there are ways in which we deal with pandemics, and there are ways in which we can get out of pandemic. So that's obviously the case. That we do think that there is a notion of efficacy, that we do understand how contact works, that we do understand what sort of ethical relationships arise in the time of COVID and so forth. So at that level, I think philosophy is certainly playing a role and is playing an important role.
You finished?
Yes.
Your answer is finished? Okay. من اول سوال رو به فارسی میپرسم، بعد به انگلیسی میپرسم از شما، چون دوستان هم میخوام متوجه بشن. آیا در فلسفه، مخصوصا در فلسفه دین، عقاید یک شخص، مثلا عقیده مذهبی و وابستگی‌های مذهبی یک شخص در فلسفه ورزی و نظریه دادن دخیل میشه یا نه؟ مثلا شما به عنوان یک فیلسوف مسلمان وقتی میخواید نظریه بدید، آیا عقاید دینی و دلبستگی‌های دینیتون بر روی نظریه‌هاتون تأثیر میگذاره یا نه؟
Yes, it does. And I think one of the big problems that we have is that we have this thing which people call philosophy of religion, but actually it is not philosophy of religion. In most cases, philosophy of a religion is usually the philosophy of Christianity and particular traditions in Christianity. So what happens is that people take their assumptions about the basic categories of religion into philosophy of religion. So that's pretty obvious. The task, I think, for people in philosophy of religion is how do they connect the insights they bring from their own tradition to those of other traditions. And this is why I think philosophy of religion always has to be done in a kind of a cooperative manner, right? So if you want to deal with, say, a question such as the existence of God or divine simplicity or evil, etc., I think what's useful is for philosophers of religion from their different perspectives to come together and to debate and discuss these sorts of questions so that they can enrich the conversation, and also so that they can come up maybe with better questions and ways of formulating what the problem is. So I think that's definitely true. I don't think we have a real kind of universal philosophy of religion at the moment.
Thanks for your answering. You finished?
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you for your answering, dear professor. Can you say? Can you say mention the name of the 10 book that influence to you?
Okay.
Can you please type the name of book after the interview?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one. Maybe we can have this as the last question because I'm just aware it's been quite a long time. So there are lots of different kinds of things which I have enjoyed reading, and some things which I like, even though I don't necessarily agree with them. So if one looks at different traditions, so obviously Pierre Hadot's conception of philosophy as a way of life and as a set of spiritual practices, spiritual exercises would definitely be there. Richard Rorty's philosophy in the mirror of nature would definitely be there. Gadamer's truth and method would definitely be there. Let me think. Paul Ricoeur's oneself as another would be there. Then, of course, within Islamic philosophical traditions, of course, I would say the Asfar of Mullah Sadr has to be there. The Mashari wa Mutarihat of Sohrawardi should be there as well. The one in the modern period, the Tuhfat al-Hakim of Muhammad Hussain Isfahani should be there.
Muhammad
Hussain Isfahani. He's the teacher of Allama Tabatabai. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how many that is. That's 6, 7, 8 maybe. Yeah, let me think.
Okay.
I think, yeah, Grace Janssen's Becoming Divine I would put there as well. It's not officially a work of philosophy, but it has very important philosophical connotations. Grace Jansen Becoming Divine is very important. Alistair McIntyre After Virtue is very important. I think that's probably enough, yes.
Okay. Dear professor, please, can you text me after the interview?
Yes.
Text me. Okay, thank you. On WhatsApp, text me.
Yeah, the names of the works. Okay, yes.
The name of the book. Yes, thank you.
Of course.
The next question, sir, what factors do you consider to be the case of the stagnation of Islamic philosophy and the lack of dynamism in Islamic philosophy? Does philosophy in the present age main philosophy of Western philosophy?
Yes, I mean, I guess this is the question about how we should really conceive of philosophy. So I think one of the problems, obviously, with Islamic philosophy is that people assume that it has to either just be Ibn Sina or Mullah Sadra, and there's nothing beyond that. And one of the points I would make is that maybe not so much from Ibn Sina, but certainly with Mullah Sadra, there is a strong sense that one should not do taqleed in matters of philosophical inquiry, but one rather has to do your own tahqiq. So as long as we stick to the idea that philosophy really should be about one's own tahqiq, then you will always have a dynamic process. And that process, of course, will involve reading the history. Pierre Heido had this very famous kind of conception that he said that the way philosophy develops is through the ways in which we read and we reread philosophers in the past, and sometimes we maybe read them in ways which they would not have thought would make sense. So we engage in what you might call a misreading of their work. So I think that that's very useful, and you find that, of course, in Islamic philosophy as well. You cannot understand Mir Damad, Mullah Sadra, etc., unless you understand them as engaging in different readings of Ibn Sina and different ways of understanding Ibn Sina.
Excuse me. Sir, generally, you consider the philosophy of East philosophy stopped. Why?
Well, it doesn't have to stop. I think this is a question of what happens in lots of contexts in which you elevate a particular historical figure, and all you do is you champion that. So you had the same problem with Kant. In Germany, you had the dominance of Kantian philosophy, well into the 20th century. Even now, of course, you have Kantians. So one could say that that's a good example of a similar sort of process in which there hasn't been a development because it's got stuck in a particular set of inquiries. And I think the same thing you could say about, where is contemporary philosophy in Islam today? And it has to be more than just repeating particular thinkers. It has to be, as I said, about thinking about the social and the ethical context, and paying much more attention to that social ethical context. So I don't think it's a question of like West or East or whatever. It's every philosophical tradition bears within it the possibility of some form of stagnation if you elevate a particular figure into kind of a status almost of scripture, where there is no questioning about the positions that they take or the arguments that they put forward, or even the formulation of the questions.
Thank you. Sir, ما سه تا سوال مونده. این سه تا سوال رو میپرسم. حالا نزدیک 2 ساعت شد.
I know. I think we should bring this to a close because it's been a long time. I mean, maybe we can do another session some other time, but I think it's been quite a long time already.
No, this question is I من یکی از این سوال‌ها رو میخونم، اگه طولانی بود برای تایم بعدی in the next time
Okay. Yeah.
مصاحبه.
Okay. So let's take this last question. Yeah.
Yes. How do you explain the state of philosophy during coronavirus and post coronavirus corona philosophy? Will corona change the way we look at the deal with issues in philosophy? Is it possible for topics to fall and new ones to emerge?
So
شما این پاسخ میدید یا بمونه برای جلسه بعد؟
I'll just quickly mention 2 or 3 things. Okay. So obviously this is a very big question, right? But let me just mention 3 things which I think the current situation has brought up, which philosophers need to address, and also that I think generally we need to address. The first question is how we distinguish between what is truthful and what is false or untruthful. As you know, there is a lot of rumor and misinformation about COVID and also about vaccines. So that's one thing. Truthfulness and what is false and what can be falsified. The second one is, I guess, this fundamental question about how do we see the nature of our society, right? How do we consider, and within that, there is this particular question about ethics. So what is it that we owe one another? You know, a lot of the situation is about not spreading a particular virus. So what does that tell you about what we owe one another? It doesn't mean that we silo ourselves and shut ourselves off. So how do we relate to one another? This big ethical question. And I think the third one might be one about the individual and the individual's liberty, the individual's freedom, and the wider notion of what the society is. And what often happens, particularly in our context in Britain and arguably in Europe and North America, people consider the COVID to bring about a set of restrictions on our liberty. But we don't consider these restrictions as a way in which we can empathize and connect ourselves to others. You know, so for example, one of my former students, former student of our department who does excellent work on activism and on, you know, this whole question of Africa and Black identity and so forth. One of the things that she said in the conversation I had with her recently, which is very, sorry, I think I paused. Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Yes. Was that she said, you know, COVID makes us understand what it means to not have a voice. You know, to be muted, not to be able to express ourselves, not to be able to travel. And that should help us to empathize with those very many people, the majority of the world for which this is already the case. The majority of the world, people do not have a voice which they can express. They do not have the power. They do not have free movement, right? And so this should help us understand what is like for the other. Like the way she put it is that this is like the whole of the world having to fast during Ramadan, right? And this is a one way in which we can understand what COVID is like Ramadan for everyone. Everyone. And so they should help us to empathize with the other and to understand the nature of restriction, how we relate to each other, and also how we can understand ourselves better. So those are the 3 things I would say very quickly.
Okay, sir, I have a 28 question.
Yeah.
I ask
We'll have to leave the others for another time.
I ask Okay, I asked 20 questions from you on the now. Can میتونید یه وقت بذارید برای فردا یا پس فردا این 8 تا سوال رو هم بپرسم ازت؟
Maybe next week. This week is difficult. So I think maybe next week will be better when teaching is almost finished.
میخواید برای جمعه برای تعطیلاتتون آخر هفته بذارید؟
Again, this week is difficult. I'm quite busy on the weekend as well. I have sort of commitments. So next week is better.
Okay. Okay. I ask from you on the WhatsApp, sir.
Okay, yeah, we can arrange a time later. We can arrange a time.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks from you. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dear professor. And keep in touch, please.
Yes. Thank you.
Please, I'm very like to keep in touch with you. خدا ممنون از شما. خدا پشت و پناهتان باشد. ممنون واقعا که دعوت ما رو پذیرفتید. حالا من در واتساپ حالا این سوال‌ها رو می‌نویسم و براتون می‌فرستم. شما هم لیست کتاب‌ها رو برای من بفرستید.
انشالله. اوکی. خیلی.
انشالله. مراقب خودتون باشید. از کرونا هم مراقبت کنید و دوری کنید. ممنون از شما. سلام.
Please stay safe as well. Yes.
Thank you.
خدا نگهدار.
خدا نگهدار. خداحافظ.